A powerful mafia boss brought a homeless young woman to his former fiancé's wedding, and what she did left everyone in stunned silence. Before we begin today's story, don't forget to like and subscribe to support our channel. We hope you enjoy the story. Dante Moretti, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, stood silently before the towering glass windows of his penthouse office, his fingers tightening around a wedding invitation until the thick paper crumpled beneath his grip. It had come from the very woman who'd walked out of his life without a second glance to chase another man, his former fiancé, and now she'd sent him an invitation, as though she wanted to press her happiness directly into his face and laugh while she watched him suffer. She actually dared to do this? He growled through clenched teeth, his deep voice carrying a dangerous edge as he hurled the invitation across the massive oak desk, as if throwing away the insult itself. A mafia boss could never appear alone, like a defeated man brought to his knees. He needed someone standing beside him, someone who'd make every person in the room stop breathing for a moment and turn to stare. Someone who'd leave his former fiancée frozen with questions about what he was planning. Later that night, as his black luxury sedan pulled away from headquarters and disappeared into the darkness of Chicago, it suddenly rolled to a stop. A small delivery truck had broken down across the narrow alley ahead, forcing his driver to wait. Dante frowned and lowered the window. That was when he saw her. A young woman sat huddled on the cold stone steps outside a closed restaurant beside the street where his car had stopped. Her clothes were torn and worn beyond repair. Her long dark brown hair hung in tangled waves around her shoulders. Yet her face was heartbreakingly beautiful. Most striking of all were her large brown eyes. They weren't lowered in desperate pleading. They were raised to meet the world with the sharpness of a blade and the fierce fire of someone who refused to surrender. Almost without thinking, Dante stepped out of the car and walked toward her. He offered enough money to change her life forever. All she had to do was let his people dress her and accompany him to an important event. But instead of lowering her head in gratitude, she looked directly into his eyes. A cold smile slowly curved across her lips, and every word she spoke sliced into his pride like the edge of a knife. So this is how mafia bosses entertain themselves, throwing money around to buy themselves a doll for the evening? Fine. I'm curious to see just how far a powerful man like you is willing to humble himself. Dante, the man whose mere arrival could make an entire city bow its head, stood completely speechless. His heart pounded with an emotion he'd never experienced before. Just who was this woman? And not a single soul inside that magnificent ballroom later that night could have imagined what she was about to unleash upon every one of them. Faced with Dante's arrogant proposal, the young woman slowly rose to her feet. She brushed the dust from her tattered coat as though she were brushing away the contempt she saw in his eyes. Then she folded her arms and met his gaze, without the slightest trace of fear. "I accept," she said, her voice remarkably calm. "But don't fool yourself into believing you've bought my gratitude with a handful of money. I'm not going with you because of your offer. I'm going because I'm curious." Dante frowned. For the first time in a long while, it felt as though the game had been turned upside down on a dark street where he was supposed to be the one holding every advantage. No one, not even the most powerful figures in his world, had ever dared speak to him with such fearless defiance. And yet this was coming from a young woman who'd been shivering on a cold stone step only moments before. He opened the rear door of the car and motioned for her to get inside. When the door closed behind her, the scent of expensive leather and the warm ambient lighting filling the cabin didn't seem to impress her in the slightest. She leaned back comfortably, as though she'd spent years riding in luxury cars like this. "You didn't even ask where we're going," Dante finally said, deliberately breaking the silence as he studied her, his steel-gray eyes never leaving her face. She gave a small shrug, the faintest mysterious smile touching her lips. "Somewhere expensive, I imagine. An event where people measure another person's worth by the watch on their wrist and the name printed on the guest list." Dante fell silent. She'd described, with unsettling accuracy, the very world he was taking her into. It was a world no homeless wanderer should have been able to imagine. "You speak as though you've stood in rooms like that before," he said quietly. This time, something flashed across her eyes. It disappeared so quickly he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. Does that really matter? She replied, skillfully sidestepping his question. As long as I play the part you need me to play. The car glided smoothly through Chicago's brightly illuminated streets, and Dante found himself watching the strange woman beside him far more closely than he cared to admit. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't intimidated. She wasn't filled with the wide-eyed curiosity anyone in her situation should have shown. You seem awfully tense for someone who's only going to a party, she suddenly remarked, her sharp brown eyes drifting toward the hand resting tightly against his knee. Or maybe this isn't just another party. Let me guess. This is the kind of event where you want someone to see you. You want someone to hurt. You want someone to regret what they did. A man who's looking for revenge. Dante turned toward her so quickly his heartbeat stumbled. She'd read him as effortlessly as though his soul had been lying open before her, touching the one secret he'd buried deeper than anyone else had ever reached. Who are you? He asked. This time it wasn't a casual question. It was a genuine demand for the truth, driven by a quiet unease that had begun creeping into the mind of a man who'd always controlled every situation around him. She turned her eyes toward the city lights drifting past outside the window. Her dark brown hair fell loosely across half her face. When she finally spoke, her voice was as soft as a whisper, yet carried a weight he couldn't begin to name. Just someone who knows how to seize an opportunity when it finds her. Mr. Moretti? Dante couldn't understand how she knew his family name when he'd never introduced himself. Before he could ask another question, the car began slowing to a stop. In that moment, he realized the woman sitting beside him that night was nothing like the ragged appearance she'd worn only an hour before. Without realizing it, he'd invited a mystery into his world, never knowing what secrets she carried with her. The car came to a smooth stop in front of one of the most prestigious beauty salons in Chicago's Gold Coast district. Warm golden light spilled through the towering glass windows, and the delicate fragrance of expensive perfume lingered in the air before they even crossed the threshold. The moment Dante escorted her inside, an entire team of stylists turned their attention toward them. Their eyes lingered for an instant on the young woman's worn and dusty appearance, before they quickly lowered their heads in respectful greeting to the powerful man none of them dared offend. I want a complete transformation, Dante ordered, his voice cold and unwavering. Her hair, her makeup, her dress, everything. The staff nodded immediately and guided her toward the salon's central velvet chair, without wasting a second. Yet what captured Dante's attention wasn't their efficiency. It was hers. She settled gracefully into the luxurious chair without the slightest hesitation, never once casting longing glances toward the shelves of high-end cosmetics or the designer gowns displayed along the walls, the kind of fascination anyone in her circumstances should have shown. If you're having second thoughts, now would be the perfect time, she called out with a hint of mockery in her voice, as one of the stylists gently began working through the knots in her tangled hair. Second thoughts about you? Dante replied, folding his arms as he leaned casually against the wall. I'd expected someone a little easier to impress. She closed her eyes while warm water flowed gently through her dark brown hair. I've lived in this world before, Mr. Moretti. There's nothing here that can amaze me anymore. Dante was about to press her for answers, but one of the stylists politely ushered him toward the waiting area. He had no choice but to leave, carrying with him a curiosity that seemed to grow stronger with every passing minute. He sat there for what felt like hours, absent-mindedly turning the heavy signet ring of his family around his finger, restless in a way he scarcely understood himself. Standing quietly in the corner, Marco, his trusted right-hand man, watched everything unfold with the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime recognizing danger before anyone else could. When Marco stepped closer and quietly whispered that something about the young woman wasn't right, that no homeless person could possibly behave with such effortless composure, as though she'd simply returned home, Dante answered only with a subtle gesture for him to remain silent, even though the very same suspicion had already begun taking root in his own mind. Then the doors to the private dressing room slowly opened. The instant she stepped outside, the entire salon seemed to fall silent. Her dark brown hair had been transformed into soft, voluminous curls that rested elegantly across her bare shoulders. Her naturally striking brown eyes were now enhanced by refined makeup that made them appear both irresistibly captivating and dangerously sharp, like the polished edge of a finely honed blade. The evening gown embraced her slender figure with flawless precision, transforming the ragged young woman who'd been shivering on a cold stone step only a short time earlier into a breathtaking lady who looked as though she'd been born to walk through the grand ballrooms of high society. Dante rose to his feet without realizing he'd done so. For one brief moment, he forgot to breathe, yet what truly shook him wasn't the astonishing beauty standing before him. It was the way she looked into the enormous mirror. There was no shock, no delight, no wide-eyed amazement. She merely tilted her head slightly, studying her own reflection with quiet familiarity, as though she'd just reunited with a forgotten version of herself that had been sleeping for years. "You're not surprised," he said, before he could stop himself, his voice rougher than he'd intended. She turned toward him, that familiar, mysterious smile returning to the corners of her lips. Taking the elegant handbag a stylist handed her, she walked toward him with calm, unhurried confidence. "Because I've always known what I look like, Mr. Moretti. I'm simply someone who knows how to seize an opportunity when it arrives." And within Dante's steel-gray eyes, curiosity had quietly evolved into something far more dangerous. It had become a suspicion he couldn't suppress, no matter how hard he tried. The car glided silently through the imposing wrought iron gates, before coming to a gentle stop in front of the magnificent Kane family estate, a grand white stone mansion overlooking the lake, where hundreds of shimmering lights illuminated the red carpet leading to the entrance. Limousines and exotic sports cars arrived one after another, delivering distinguished guests draped in glittering jewelry and wearing the finest designer gowns and tailored suits money could buy. Somewhere beneath that elegant gathering, Dante knew all too well that the room held more than wealthy aristocrats. Hidden among them were figures from the shadows, people whose influence couldn't be measured in public titles, and where a single nod offered to the wrong person could cost someone everything. Dante stepped out first, calmly straightening the front of his charcoal gray suit before extending his hand toward the open car door. The moment her slender fingers settled into his palm, the instant her high heels touched the red carpet, and her breathtaking figure emerged beneath the golden lights, the world around them seemed to pause. Every eye turned toward her. Women leaned close to whisper among themselves, trying to guess the identity of the mysterious beauty walking arm in arm with Dante Moretti. The men followed her with open admiration they couldn't hide, yet she remained completely unshaken. Her chin stayed proudly lifted as her sharp brown eyes drifted calmly across the crowd, with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime being the center of attention. She walked with effortless grace, as though this glittering world had always been the place where she truly belonged. "Stay close to me," Dante murmured near her ear, as they approached the main entrance, his voice low and controlled. "Be careful, smile, and don't attract any unnecessary attention." She glanced sideways at him, one eyebrow lifting with unmistakable amusement. "Did you bring me here to make your former fiancé jealous?" she asked softly, "or did you expect me to become invisible?" Dante pressed his lips together without answering. Once again, she'd uncovered the truth he'd never spoken aloud. "That's what I thought," she replied with the faintest smile. "Then you'd better decide what you really want, Mr. Moretti, because I was never very good at becoming invisible." Together they crossed the massive hand-carved wooden doors and entered the grand ballroom, where enormous crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm golden light above a sea of powerful guests. The gentle melodies of a live orchestra drifted through the air, blending with the delicate clinking of crystal glasses raised in celebration. Dante could feel curious eyes following every step they took. Influential men and women greeted him with polite nods that carried equal measures of respect and caution, acknowledging the arrival of one of the city's most feared men. The atmosphere inside the ballroom grew heavier with every step as he guided her through the crowd. Beside him, she remained astonishingly composed, her quiet brown eyes studying every corner of the room like a master strategist examining an entire chessboard before making the opening move. Then, beyond the sea of elegantly dressed guests, the bride and her future husband appeared at the far end of the ballroom. Dante's gaze stopped instantly on the woman with platinum blonde hair, radiant beneath the soft lights in a flawless white wedding gown. Her smile had been perfected with meticulous care, beautiful enough to captivate everyone who looked upon her. Serena Vale, his former fiancée, stood there with breathtaking beauty and the cold perfection of finely sculpted ice beside Victor Kane, the man every influential family hoped would one day marry one of their daughters. He was wealthy, traditional, calculating, and everything high society admired. Serena's eyes wandered absent-mindedly across the ballroom before suddenly finding Dante. For the briefest instant, surprise flickered across her beautiful face at the sight of him. Then her gaze shifted toward the woman standing beside him, and everything inside her expression froze. A flash of confusion appeared in her icy blue eyes as she searched her memory, desperately trying to recognize the breathtaking stranger at his side. Dante gently tightened his fingers around the young woman's hand. A cold, carefully calculated smile slowly spread across his lips as he led her directly toward the bride and groom. Around them, the ballroom itself seemed to stop breathing, waiting for the moment those two women would finally come face to face. Dante stopped in front of the newly married couple and inclined his head with restrained, icy courtesy. "Serena, congratulations on your wedding day," he said, his voice calm, though beneath it lay a layer of unmistakable frost. Serena blinked several times before forcing herself to smile. "Dante, this is unexpected. I didn't think you'd come." "Of course I'd come," he replied, glancing toward the woman standing beside him. "And I brought someone with me." Serena's eyes immediately shifted to the young woman, studying her from head to toe with suspicion that was only barely concealed beneath flawless makeup and practiced elegance. "I don't believe we've been introduced. You are—" Before Dante could answer, the young woman gracefully extended her hand, her voice clear, warm, and filled with quiet confidence. "Arya, it's a pleasure to meet you." Serena hesitated for the briefest moment before accepting the handshake. As their eyes met, something unsettled flashed across the bride's face. "You look so familiar," Serena blurted out, unable to hide the confusion in her voice. Arya tilted her head ever so slightly. The smile resting on her lips was both gentle and as sharp as the edge of a finely honed blade. "Really? Perhaps high society is simply a very small world. People always seem to cross paths again somewhere." Serena struggled to force another smile, but Dante could clearly see the tension tightening around the corners of her eyes, exactly as he'd hoped it would. Victor Kane cleared his throat, attempting to dissolve the uncomfortable silence settling over them. "Shall we make a toast?" he suggested, lifting his glass of champagne. Dante gave a slight nod, but just as he was about to step away, Arya smiled, leisurely took a delicate sip of champagne, and quietly spoke words that brought all four of them to a standstill. "I wish both of you every happiness. Marriage is a sacred promise. I was engaged once myself." Serena and Victor exchanged a quick glance. "Really?" Serena asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Arya nodded, her warm brown eyes never leaving the bride's face. "But it didn't happen. My fiancé decided I wasn't worthy enough for his family." A chill traveled slowly down Dante's spine. He knew those weren't the careless reflections of someone reminiscing about the past. They were a carefully wrapped message, delivered with remarkable precision. Serena had clearly understood it as well. Her icy blue eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "What an interesting coincidence," she replied, and for the first time her voice carried the unmistakable tremor of uncertainty. Arya simply smiled. "I think so too." An uneasy silence settled over the small circle. Dante watched Serena fighting to preserve her composure. Every few moments, her eyes returned to Arya's face, desperately searching through memories for a name, for a face she was certain she'd seen somewhere before. Yet the harder she searched, the more unsettled she became. Then Arya gently rested her hand upon Dante's arm. Her voice was soft, yet every word carried deliberate purpose. "Would you like to dance?" Dante looked at her in surprise for a moment. "Dance?" he echoed. Arya raised one eyebrow with playful amusement. "Or would you rather stay here and watch your former fiancée exhaust herself, trying to remember where she knows me from?" A quiet laugh escaped Dante's lips, an emotion he'd never expected to experience on this particular night. "Then let's dance," he said, leading her away and leaving Serena standing motionless behind them, her face drained of color beneath a silence filled with confusion and an unspoken sense of dread. As they drifted gracefully across the dance floor, beneath the gentle melody of the orchestra, Dante looked deeply into her rich brown eyes. His hand guided her movements with effortless strength and perfect precision. "You did that on purpose," he said. It wasn't a question, it was a certainty. Arya smiled softly, tilting her head just enough for a spark of challenge to shimmer within her eyes. "Didn't I already tell you?" she whispered. "I used to belong to this world." And in that single moment, beneath the glittering crystal chandeliers and surrounded by the music flowing through the ballroom, Dante realized something with absolute certainty. The woman resting in his arms that night wasn't a homeless stranger he'd happened to rescue from the streets. She was a player who'd stepped onto the chessboard of her own choosing, carrying a purpose he still couldn't begin to see through. When the music finally came to an end, Dante escorted Arya back into the crowd. Before long, they found themselves surrounded by a circle of powerful men, influential tycoons and crime bosses he knew well. Each held a glass of fine liquor. Each wore the kind of polite smile that concealed careful scrutiny. "Moretti, you've finally decided to show up at a social gathering," one of them remarked as he shook Dante's hand. His attention immediately shifted toward Arya, his curiosity impossible to hide. And who might this beautiful companion be? Before Dante had the chance to answer, Arya stepped forward with effortless grace and extended her hand. "I'm Arya. It's a pleasure to meet all of you," she said, carrying herself with such natural confidence that not a single man questioned whether she belonged there. Then one distinguished gentleman with silver streaks in his hair asked what she did for a living. Arya casually lifted a glass of champagne from the tray of a passing server, slowly swirling the golden liquid before answering. "I enjoy following the art market. Lately, auctions featuring contemporary painters have created some remarkably fascinating trends, especially when the true value of a masterpiece is often hidden behind the people quietly manipulating it from the shadows." A brief silence settled over the group as the men exchanged surprised glances. None of them had expected such a thoughtful, sophisticated answer from a young woman whose face none of them recognized. "That's quite a specialized subject," one of the businessmen observed. Arya simply smiled before taking another graceful sip of champagne. "I merely pay attention to patterns. After all, everything comes down to one simple thing. Who receives the information first? Doesn't it?" The group burst into warm laughter, drawn almost effortlessly into her sharp wit and quiet charm, before they even realized it. Dante stood silently nearby, watching everything unfold. A growing sense of unease tightened inside his chest. Arya wasn't merely blending into his world, she was quietly taking command of it. Then, from the opposite side of the ballroom, his eyes met Victor Kane's. Victor wasn't simply looking at her. He was studying her with unusual intensity, like a man who'd begun sensing that something about this mysterious woman wasn't what it appeared to be. Before Dante could give the thought another moment, a cool hand gently touched his elbow. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but the expression in her eyes had turned hard. "May I have a moment with you, Dante?" she asked softly. He nodded, leaving Arya surrounded by the fascinated circle of influential men, while he followed Serena onto the quiet balcony. Outside, the night air carried a biting chill. The distant city lights shimmered across the darkness. Yet the woman standing before him looked even colder than the evening itself. "Who is she, Dante?" Serena asked directly, folding her arms across her chest. Dante's expression remained unreadable. "Arya, my companion." Serena let out a dry, humorless laugh. "Don't treat me like I'm a fool. I know exactly the kind of women you usually bring to events like this. She doesn't fit that pattern." Irritation slowly rose inside him. "Then what exactly do you want to know, Serena?" he asked. She locked her eyes onto his and lowered her voice. "Where did she come from? You picked her up off the street, didn't you?" For the briefest moment, Dante hesitated. Only a single second, but it was enough. Serena caught it immediately. "My God," she whispered, as though the final missing piece had suddenly fallen into place. Triumph mixed with disbelief flickered inside her eyes. "You really did bring that woman in from the street." Dante didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. His silence answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Serena slowly straightened her posture, her face growing firm as though she'd just reached an important decision. "If I were you, I'd be very careful, Dante. That woman didn't enter your life by accident." Without another word, she turned and walked back into the ballroom, leaving him standing alone on the windswept balcony, while the doubts she'd awakened continued swirling relentlessly through his mind. The car pulled away from the Kane estate, gliding into the quiet Chicago night as streaks of streetlights drifted across the windows. Inside the silent cabin, Dante leaned back against the leather seat, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the face of the woman beside him. Serena's warning continued echoing through his mind, like a splinter driven too deeply to remove. "I have a few questions for you," he finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was low and cold. Arya turned toward him with the same composed expression she'd worn all evening. "Go ahead and ask," she replied calmly. "But I don't promise I'll answer every one of them." The corner of Dante's mouth lifted into the faintest smile at her fearless response. "You knew far too much tonight, Arya. You spoke about the art market, about private auctions, about the people manipulating everything from behind the scenes, as though you'd lived in the very heart of that world. A woman I picked up from a freezing sidewalk shouldn't know things that even some of the people inside that ballroom don't fully understand." She tilted her head slightly, allowing the soft curls of her dark brown hair to fall over one shoulder. Her warm brown eyes remained as calm as ever, almost unsettling in their stillness. "So in your opinion, someone living on the streets isn't allowed to be educated? Or do you believe only people wearing designer clothes deserve to understand how the world works?" Dante frowned. "Don't change the subject. You know exactly what I mean. You didn't behave like someone who'd never seen that world before. You behaved like someone who once belonged to it." Arya remained silent for a brief moment. Her gaze drifted toward the city passing beyond the window. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, yet carefully guarded. "Maybe I've spent years reading. Maybe I overheard conversations in places you'd never imagine. Or maybe I'm simply better at observing than you give me credit for. People can learn an extraordinary amount when survival depends on staying alert, Mr. Moretti. That still doesn't explain the way you looked at Serena tonight," Dante continued, refusing to let the matter rest. "You deliberately brought up your former fiancé while standing right in front of her. You wanted to make her uncomfortable. You wanted her trying to remember who you were. I don't believe that was an accident." For the briefest instant, something flickered across her eyes. It looked like instinctive self-protection, as though an invisible wall had suddenly risen between them, but it disappeared almost immediately, replaced by the familiar faint smile. "You're imagining things that aren't there, Dante. Wasn't it you who wanted your former fiancé to feel unsettled? I was simply playing the role you hired me to play. Or did I perform it so well that now you've started questioning me too?" Her answer stopped him cold. Once again, she'd turned the conversation completely around, transforming his accusations into something that sounded almost unreasonable. He realized that every time he tried to corner her, she slipped effortlessly beyond his reach, with replies as sharp as finely crafted blades, never revealing even the smallest fragment of the truth. "You're very good," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on hers. "You're so good at avoiding answers that it makes people wonder what you're hiding." Arya looked directly back at him. The gentle smile remained upon her lips, but her eyes darkened with an emotion he couldn't begin to understand. "Perhaps everyone has something they'd rather keep hidden, and perhaps you should learn to respect that." Then she leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes, as though the conversation had already ended. Dante sat in silence, his jaw tightening as frustration and curiosity twisted together inside his chest. When the car finally stopped outside the hotel where he'd arranged for her to stay, he watched her elegant figure disappear beyond the glass doors. Standing there alone, he made a quiet promise to himself. He'd uncover the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. He'd find out exactly who this woman really was, and what she truly wanted. The hotel room door closed softly behind her, and the moment she was finally alone in the quiet stillness, the calm mask Arya had worn throughout the entire evening seemed to loosen ever so slightly. She leaned back against the door, closed her eyes, and allowed her breathing to settle into its natural rhythm after hours of living, with every nerve stretched painfully tight. A few moments later, she walked toward the large mirror hanging in the corner of the room. The reflection staring back at her stopped her in her tracks. The woman gazing at her from the mirror, with softly curled dark brown hair, piercing brown eyes, and a breathtaking evening gown, wasn't the ragged young woman who'd been huddled on a freezing stone step only hours before. She was a ghost she'd believed had been buried forever. She was the Arya who'd belonged beneath crystal chandeliers, who'd attended elegant concerts, who'd once lived a life that had been cruelly stolen from her. She slowly lifted her hand and brushed her fingertips against her cheek, feeling the smooth layer of makeup beneath her skin. For one fleeting moment, her chest tightened with an old ache that had never truly disappeared. This face reminded her of everything she'd once possessed, and everything she'd lost. It reminded her of her father's face. It reminded her of the home she'd once called her own. It reminded her of the years when she'd still believed the world was capable of being fair. But she refused to let herself remain vulnerable for long. Drawing a slow, steady breath, she forced the rising emotion back into the deepest corner of her heart, exactly as she'd taught herself to do throughout the years. Then she walked to the edge of the bed and sat down, folding her hands together as she began carefully reconsidering every step of her plan. Everything was unfolding far more quickly than she'd expected. She could see that with perfect clarity now. Dante Moretti wasn't a man who could be deceived easily. The way he'd questioned her inside the car had been far sharper than she'd anticipated. His questions were no longer driven by idle curiosity. They'd reached the edge of genuine suspicion. She understood that one small mistake, one careless moment, would be enough for him to follow the thread all the way to the truth she'd protected with her very life. She'd prepared for the moment she'd come face to face with Serena. She'd anticipated returning to that world. But she'd never imagined that the very man who'd brought her there would become the greatest threat to everything she'd planned. And he wasn't a threat she could afford to underestimate. She turned toward the window, watching the distant city lights shimmer against the darkness of the Chicago night. Determination slowly hardened across her face. She knew that if she intended to walk this road to its very end, the road that would allow her to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her, she'd have to rethink every move with extraordinary care. She'd have to become faster, smarter, colder. She'd have to stay one step ahead before Dante managed to tear away the veil that concealed who she truly was. The following morning, Dante sat alone in his office high above the city, gazing through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Chicago disappeared beneath a veil of morning mist. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number he hadn't called in a very long time. "I need you to investigate someone for me," he said bluntly the instant the call was answered. A man's gravelly voice responded with a quiet laugh. "It's been a while, Moretti. Who's the target?" "A woman named Arya," Dante replied. "I want to know everything about her, where she came from, who she really is, and why she seems to be hiding something." The investigator promised he'd have answers within 2 days. Yet only a few hours later, the phone rang again. This time, the man's voice carried an unusual note of confusion. "Something's wrong here, Moretti. I couldn't find anything. This woman practically doesn't exist. No current identification, no registered address, no financial accounts. It's as though she deliberately erased every trace of her present life. This isn't how an ordinary homeless person disappears. This is how someone disappears on purpose." Dante tightened his grip around the phone. With every word he heard, the uneasiness inside him grew heavier. That very evening, he drove to the hotel where Arya was staying and knocked on her door without giving any warning. When the door opened, she stood before him dressed simply. Her dark brown hair fell naturally around her shoulders, and the elegant makeup from the previous evening was gone. Yet the quiet dignity she'd carried all night remained untouched. "You don't seem like the kind of man who announces his arrival," she remarked as she stepped aside, allowing him inside. Dante walked straight to the center of the room before turning to face her. "I had someone investigate you," he said without hesitation. She raised one eyebrow ever so slightly, showing no surprise whatsoever. "And what did you find?" "Nothing," he answered, locking his steel-gray eyes onto hers. "You don't exist, Arya. There isn't a single record. It's as though you erased your own life with your own hands. I want to know why." Silence lingered between them for several long moments. Then she walked toward the window, folded her arms, and stared out into the darkness beyond the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentle, yet beneath it rested a bitterness so deep it seemed impossible to measure. "I grew up in a world very much like yours, Dante. Lavish parties, powerful families, grand rooms glowing beneath crystal chandeliers. I once had all of that." She paused before continuing. "Until betrayal stole everything from me in a single night. I lost it all. I lost so completely that the only way to survive was to erase myself." Dante frowned. He could feel another story hidden beneath those words, one she still refused to tell. "Who betrayed you?" he asked. She turned back toward him with a quiet, sorrowful smile. "That's a story for another night, Mr. Moretti." Then she silently escorted him to the door, leaving him with even more questions than he'd brought with him. The following day, the investigator called again. This time, however, his voice sounded entirely different. It was cautious, tense, almost reluctant. "I tracked her face through some old photographs, and I finally found her, Moretti. Her real name is Arya Sinclair. She's the daughter of Thomas Sinclair." Dante froze. The name echoed through his memory like the ringing of a distant bell. "Sinclair," he repeated quietly. "The owner of Sinclair Fine Art." "Exactly," the investigator replied. "The family behind one of the country's most prestigious galleries and auction houses. Their empire collapsed several years ago after a financial scandal that shook the entire industry. Thomas Sinclair was accused of fraud. The family's fortune disappeared. Their lives fell apart. But here's the part that matters most. The people responsible for setting the trap that destroyed the Sinclair family were the Vale family." The blood seemed to drain from Dante's body. "Vale," he whispered, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Serena's family." He slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the towering windows overlooking the city as darkness gradually settled across the skyline. In that single moment, every scattered piece of the puzzle finally locked into place, forming a picture that sent an icy chill through his entire body. At last, he understood the truth. The woman he'd believed he'd rescued by chance from a freezing sidewalk that night had never entered his life by accident. That night, Dante couldn't sit still. He drove through the sleeping streets of Chicago to the hotel once again. When Arya opened the door, a trace of exhaustion lingering across her face, he stepped inside without waiting to be invited. Turning to face her, he spoke without hesitation. "I know who you are now, Arya Sinclair." In that single moment, he saw her warm brown eyes waver ever so slightly. For the first time, the wall of protection she'd hidden behind for so long seemed to crack. She remained silent for a long while, before slowly walking toward the window. Wrapping her arms around herself, she held on as though trying to keep herself from falling apart. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, carrying the unbearable weight of pain she'd buried for far too many years. "My father, Thomas Sinclair, was the kindest man I've ever known. He built Sinclair Fine Art with his entire life, with passion, honesty, and unwavering integrity. He believed in people. He believed that if he lived honorably, the world would treat him with the same fairness." She paused, her breathing trembling ever so slightly. Then the Vale family appeared. They came to him as strategic partners, as trusted friends. My father welcomed them with open arms, never realizing they'd seen him as nothing more than a shield from the very beginning. They used his company. They used his spotless reputation to conceal their own corrupt dealings. And when everything finally collapsed, when the storm came crashing down, they placed every ounce of blame upon his shoulders. Dante stood motionless, every word striking him like fragments of shattered glass. My father was accused. His name was destroyed. The honor he'd spent an entire lifetime building disappeared in a single night. We lost our home. We lost everything. Her voice broke beneath the weight of the memory. And then, he died before he ever had the chance to prove he was innocent. He left this world carrying a name stained by crimes that belonged to someone else. A single tear rolled slowly down her cheek. It was the first tear Dante had ever seen from the woman who'd always carried herself with such unshakable pride. My mother couldn't survive the grief. She collapsed after my father's death. Her health faded little by little until she left me too. Then I was alone. No family, no home, not even enough money to survive. I wandered the streets, and I learned one lesson above all others: never trust anyone. Dante stepped closer. In a gesture of tenderness so rare it surprised even him, he gently lifted her chin, asking her with his touch to look into his eyes. "You don't have to carry all of this alone anymore," he whispered. But she immediately turned her face away from his hand. "I don't need a savior, Dante." He drew a slow breath, forcing himself to suppress the overwhelming urge to pull her into his arms. "I know," he answered quietly, his voice softer than before. "But that doesn't mean you have to bear all of this by yourself." Arya slowly raised her eyes to meet his. Within those tear-filled brown eyes, something softened for the briefest moment, as though the ice that had surrounded her heart for so many years had begun to melt, if only slightly. But she quickly turned away again, refusing to let herself remain vulnerable any longer. After Dante left the room, she stood silently beside the window for a long time. Then she reached into the hidden compartment at the bottom of her bag and carefully removed an old cell phone she'd kept concealed. Her trembling fingers hurriedly typed a short message. "He knows who I am now. He's started investigating." Only a few seconds later, the screen lit up with a reply. "Then it's time for you to decide your next move, Arya. Every piece of evidence is still exactly where I've kept it. I'm only waiting for your signal. Your father deserves to have his name cleared, and I gave him my word that I'd make sure it happened." Arya stared at those words for a long time, her face hardening beneath the dim light of the room. The man on the other end of the conversation was her father's former trusted attorney, the only person who'd never stopped believing in the Sinclair family's innocence. He was also the man who'd quietly arranged for her path to cross with Dante Moretti's, and who'd spent every passing day protecting the evidence capable of overturning everything the world believed to be true. As she lowered the phone, Arya understood with absolute certainty that the final moment of decision was drawing closer than ever before. Only a few days later, the name Serena had desperately struggled to remember throughout her wedding night finally surfaced with perfect clarity. The moment she realized the woman walking beside Dante that evening had been Arya Sinclair, the daughter she'd believed had vanished forever beneath the ruins of the fallen Sinclair family, an icy wave of panic quietly began spreading through her. More than anyone else, Serena understood that Arya's return wasn't simply an unexpected reunion. It was a threat capable of exposing everything her family had spent years burying beneath carefully crafted lies. And Serena wasn't the kind of woman who waited for danger to arrive. She struck first. By the following morning, tabloid newspapers and celebrity gossip websites were flooded with sensational headlines about Arya. They twisted every detail of her past, transforming her from the victim of an unimaginable tragedy into a shameless opportunist. They painted her as a woman who'd once wandered the streets with nothing, only to manipulate powerful men in order to climb her way back into high society. Before long, the public was reading stories describing her as nothing more than a calculating fraud who deliberately set a trap for Dante Moretti himself. The rumors spread with astonishing speed. Later that morning, Arya walked into Dante's office, carrying a stack of newspapers. Dante read every vicious article in silence, and with every poisonous sentence, the cold fury burning inside his steel-gray eyes grew stronger. "You've seen them," he finally said, tossing one newspaper onto his desk. Arya gave a quiet nod, before placing another magazine beside it. "Serena is trying to destroy me all over again, exactly the way her family destroyed my father." Her voice remained unnervingly calm, but the newspapers were only the beginning. That evening, as Arya stepped outside the hotel, she stopped abruptly beside the car parked along the curb. Deep scratches had been carved across the side window, and etched into the damaged glass was a crude message, a warning so chilling that the blood inside her veins seemed to freeze the instant she read it. Someone was trying to plant fear inside her heart. Then her phone vibrated inside her pocket. An anonymous text message flashed across the screen, warning her to know when to stop before it was too late. It hinted that the past always found a way to return and destroy anyone reckless enough to uncover it again. She stood motionless beneath the pale glow of the streetlights. Yet, instead of calling anyone else, her fingers instinctively dialed Dante's number. He was the one person she'd never intended to depend upon, and yet he was the very first person she thought of in that moment. He arrived less than 15 minutes later. His car pulled to the curb beside hers, and the instant he stepped out and saw the message carved into the damaged window, along with the color drained from her face, a blaze of anger erupted inside him. Yet instead of shouting, his rage hardened into something far more terrifying. Cold, controlled, and merciless. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. When she nodded, he immediately pulled out his phone and called his security team. His voice became sharp with authority as he ordered them to review every surveillance camera in the area until they found whoever was responsible. "Starting now, you'll have security with you 24 hours a day," he said firmly, leaving no room for argument. "That won't change until we find the person behind all of this." Arya looked at him, and instead of the fear her enemies had hoped to awaken inside her, a fierce determination ignited within her warm brown eyes. "Do you really think a few words carved into a car window and a fabricated scandal in the newspapers are enough to frighten me, Dante?" she asked, her voice remarkably steady. "I've already lost everything. I've walked through hell and survived. There's nothing Serena, or anyone else, can still take from me that would make me afraid." Dante looked at her in silence. Even as anger continued burning inside him, he couldn't help feeling a profound admiration for the extraordinary strength of the woman standing before him. At that moment, he understood with absolute certainty that the war between them and the Vale family had truly begun, and from this point forward, there would be no turning back for anyone involved. From that night forward, Dante and Arya were no longer a powerful crime boss and the woman he'd hired for a single evening. They became two people fighting on the same side. Dante mobilized his entire network, assigning Marco the task of tracking down the people responsible for vandalizing Arya's car and sending the anonymous threats. With the instincts and experience of a man who'd spent his life hunting through the shadows, Marco returned only a few days later with answers. He walked into Dante's office wearing a grim expression and placed a thick file on the desk. "I found the man behind it," he reported. Every attack against Arya was orchestrated by a former operative of the Vale family. He handled their dirty work for years, and now someone's hired him to stop her before she becomes impossible to control. Arya lowered her eyes to the name printed on the file. Not a trace of fear crossed her face. Instead, a calm, icy determination settled into her warm brown eyes. "Then I'll meet him," she said. Although Dante wasn't pleased with the idea, he remained at her side as she arranged a face-to-face meeting with the man. They confronted him inside a secluded room. At first, the man tried to hide behind arrogance, but Arya simply stepped closer. Her cold, unwavering eyes locked onto his as she spoke with quiet authority. "Do you really believe you can frighten me? Let me tell you something. I've already lost everything. I've slept on freezing sidewalks. I've known hunger. I've watched the entire world turn its back on me. There's nothing left in this life that can make me retreat. And if you, or the people who hired you, continue this game, then believe me, I won't be the one trembling with fear." The man swallowed hard. Every trace of arrogance disappeared from his face, beneath the force of her unshakable presence. In that moment, he realized he'd chosen the wrong opponent. Yet the encounter itself wasn't what truly shifted the balance in their favor. That happened later, when Arya brought Dante to a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Waiting there was an elderly gentleman with silver hair and kind, thoughtful eyes. "This is Uncle Harold," Arya said softly, her voice gentler than Dante had ever heard before. "He was my father's trusted attorney, and the only person who never stopped believing in my family's innocence." The older man greeted Dante with a respectful nod, before placing a worn leather briefcase on the table. "I've protected these for years," he said quietly. "I've been waiting for the day Arya became strong enough to return." He opened the weathered case, revealing thick folders filled with documents, recorded conversations, signed agreements, and carefully preserved evidence. "Everything is here. Every illegal transaction the Vale family carried out under Thomas Sinclair's name, the emails directing the scheme, the recorded conversations, the signatures. There's more than enough evidence to prove that her father was completely innocent, and that the Vale family created the entire conspiracy to frame him. In that instant, Dante realized something else. This was also the man who'd quietly arranged for Arya's path to intersect with his, on that unforgettable night, transforming what had appeared to be a chance encounter into one carefully planned step within a strategy years in the making. Dante picked up one of the files and slowly turned its pages. A cold, determined light appeared within his steel-gray eyes. He understood exactly what these documents represented. They were no longer defending themselves. They now possessed a weapon powerful enough to bring down an entire empire. "All right," he said quietly, as he closed the file and set it back onto the table. His eyes met Arya's. "Now it's our turn to make the first move. Serena Vale won't even realize what's waiting for her until it's far too late." In that moment, all three of them understood the same truth. The trap had already been laid. Now they had only to wait for the prey to walk willingly into it. A few days later, Arya received an elegant invitation, delivered directly to her hotel. It was an invitation to an exclusive private gala reserved only for carefully selected members of the Vale family's elite club. Both she and Dante immediately understood that it wasn't an act of hospitality. It was a trap Serena had carefully prepared, hoping to corner Arya on the enemy's own ground. "This is obviously a trap," Dante said, his face tense with concern. But Arya merely smiled. "I know. But this is the moment I've been waiting for all these years, and I won't run away." On the night of the gala, the Vale family estate shimmered beneath countless lights as the city's most influential guests filled its grand halls. Arya arrived alone, dressed in a midnight black evening gown that radiated both power and mystery. She walked with effortless grace, her head held high, her warm brown eyes so calm that the people waiting to watch her crumble found themselves growing uneasy instead. Serena stepped forward to greet her with a poisonous smile. "Arya, I'm so pleased you accepted my invitation," she said sweetly, every word dripping with venom. "You know, the media simply can't get enough of your story these days." The woman who climbed up from the sidewalk, trying so desperately to belong. Without the slightest reaction, Arya lifted a glass of champagne from a passing server's tray and answered calmly, "I've always been accustomed to being the center of attention." "That's something you've spent your entire life longing for, yet you've never once earned it honestly, have you, Serena?" A flash of anger ignited inside Serena's icy blue eyes, but she quickly regained her composure. Leaning close to Arya's ear, she lowered her voice to a dangerous whisper. "Listen carefully. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many expensive gowns you wear, you'll never become somebody. You'll always be nothing more than the shattered remains of a family that collapsed." Arya slowly turned to face her. Instead of looking wounded, a cold smile curled across her lips. "You're wrong." At that exact moment, a tall figure emerged through the crowd. Dante Moretti's arrival caused Serena and everyone standing nearby to freeze where they stood. "My dear Serena," Dante said, his voice as cold as winter itself, extending a sealed envelope toward her. "It seems you haven't read tomorrow's news yet." Serena frowned as she opened the envelope, but the moment her eyes scanned the documents inside, the color drained from her beautiful face. Her hands began trembling uncontrollably. Inside were the complete records exposing every crime committed by the Vale family. The evidence was undeniable. Every document proved they had orchestrated the financial scandal, used Thomas Sinclair as a scapegoat, and deliberately destroyed an innocent family to protect themselves. "These are fake," Serena whispered, her voice barely audible. Arya answered with perfect composure. "No, they're real, and tomorrow morning they'll be on the front page of every newspaper." Serena completely lost control. She looked around the room in horror as she realized every pair of eyes had turned toward her. Whispers spread across the ballroom like a rising tide. Then the massive doors at the entrance swung open. In the stunned silence that followed, a group of law enforcement officials entered alongside several powerful leaders from the very families that had once stood beside the Vales, but had now abandoned them. Serena Vale, one of the officials announced, his voice echoing across the room. You're under arrest for financial fraud, money laundering, and market manipulation. Serena let out a desperate, broken laugh. You can't do this to me. I'm Serena Vale. But no one was listening anymore. As the officers moved toward her, the empire her family had spent decades building collapsed before her eyes, in front of the very people who had once admired her and bowed to her influence. As they escorted her away, Arya stepped closer and leaned toward her ear. Her voice was gentle, yet colder than ice. Now you finally know what it feels like to lose everything, Serena. It's exactly what my father endured. Serena twisted around and glared at her with eyes blazing with hatred, screaming that this wasn't over. But her voice faded as she was led away and disappeared from sight. Arya remained standing quietly in the center of the magnificent ballroom. She drew a long, steady breath. For the first time after so many years spent living beneath the crushing weight of grief, betrayal, and vengeance, she felt something she'd believed had been lost forever. She felt freedom. Several months passed after that fateful night, and everything had changed in ways neither of them could have imagined. Serena's arrest quickly dominated every major headline, triggering the rapid collapse of the entire Vale family as one business partner after another abandoned them. The powerful empire that had once inspired fear throughout the city crumbled within only a few weeks. Most important of all, Thomas Sinclair's honor was finally restored. The name that had once been stained with disgrace was cleared before the public, allowing Arya to carry her father's surname with pride once again, without ever having to hide from it. One evening, as they sat together inside Dante's penthouse overlooking the glittering city through towering windows, he quietly placed an envelope on the table in front of her. "What's this?" Arya asked, a slight frown crossing her face. Dante simply nodded toward it. "Open it." Inside was a business proposal, a detailed plan to rebuild Sinclair Fine Art, the gallery and auction house that carried the very name her father had devoted his entire life to creating. Arya's eyes widened as she slowly turned each page. "You want to do this?" she whispered, her voice catching with surprise. "I want to help you rebuild everything," Dante replied. The usual hardness in his steel-gray eyes softened in a way she'd rarely seen. "A legacy that carries your family's name, a place where you can reclaim everything that was stolen from you." Arya gently placed the proposal back onto the table and folded her arms. Her familiar pride immediately resurfaced. "Dante, I don't need your pity. I won't accept charity from anyone." He gave a quiet laugh and slowly shook his head. "This isn't charity, Arya. It's a partnership. You're talented, you have vision, you understand the art world better than anyone I've ever met. I'm simply investing in someone I believe will succeed, and I want you to have something that's truly yours." She remained silent for a long moment, studying his face carefully, as though searching for even the smallest sign of deception. She found nothing except sincerity. Finally, she let out a quiet breath. "All right. But we'll do it my way." Dante smiled. "Wouldn't have it any other way." From that day forward, Arya threw herself into the work with all her heart. She assembled her own team, reconnected with trusted relationships from her past, and slowly reclaimed her place within the art world, one careful step at a time. Throughout it all, Dante remained quietly beside her. He never tried to control her decisions, yet somehow, he was always there whenever she needed him. But it wasn't the business that slowly began changing her heart. It was the countless little things he did for her, every single day. Every morning when she arrived at the office, a cup of hot coffee was already waiting on her desk, prepared exactly the way she liked it. "Just something to keep you going," he'd say with the briefest smile. Then one late afternoon, after an exhausting day of work, she returned to her office and stopped in her tracks. A bouquet of pure white lilies rested neatly on her desk. Beside it lay a small handwritten note in Dante's strong, unmistakable handwriting. "I know you love coffee more than flowers, but I still hope you'll like these." Arya picked up the note, and before she realized it, a gentle smile had appeared across her lips. A quiet warmth slowly spread through her chest, a feeling she'd refused to let herself experience for far too many years. She lifted the bouquet and breathed in its delicate fragrance. In that silent moment, she realized the walls she'd built around her heart for so many years were beginning to crack. And something new, something she both feared and secretly longed for, was quietly taking root deep inside her, growing stronger with every passing day, no matter how hard she tried to stop it. Many more months slipped quietly by, and under Arya's steady guidance, Sinclair Fine Art slowly came back to life. The galleries glowed with light once again. Auction houses began attracting distinguished collectors from every corner of the country, and the Sinclair name was spoken with admiration instead of scandal, as though Thomas Sinclair himself were smiling proudly upon his daughter from somewhere beyond this world. Throughout that entire journey, Dante remained faithfully by her side, though always in his own quiet way. He never imposed his will or tried to make decisions for her. Instead, he stood silently behind her, protecting her from dangers she hadn't yet recognized herself. There was the day an investor arrived wearing the polished smile of a successful businessman, carrying a contract filled with carefully hidden traps. Dante was the first to recognize the deception, stopping her before she could sign her name. "This man can't be trusted," he said. "He's trying to hollow out your company from the inside." And, just as he'd predicted, he was right. Then, when a newspaper deliberately twisted the story of Arya's return, spreading malicious rumors intended to undermine the fragile reputation Sinclair Fine Art had worked so hard to rebuild, Dante used every ounce of his influence to make certain the truth was told fairly, ensuring her voice wasn't buried beneath lies and manipulation. One evening, after an endless day filled with exhausting meetings, Arya remained alone in her dimly lit office. Her shoulders sagged beneath the weight of exhaustion. The door quietly opened, and Dante stepped inside carrying a bottle of red wine and 2 glasses. His eyes rested upon her with unmistakable tenderness and concern. "You look exhausted," he said softly, as he placed the bottle on the desk. "Do you want to talk?" Arya looked up at him. For the first time, instead of raising the familiar walls she'd always hidden behind, she simply nodded. She watched him pour a glass of wine, before taking the seat beside her. Then, beneath the warm glow of the office lights, she allowed herself to open her heart completely, for the very first time in years. She told him about the freezing nights she'd spent on the streets, about the crushing loneliness that had nearly consumed her, about the dreams she'd believed had been buried forever beneath grief and betrayal. Dante listened quietly from beginning to end. He never judged her, he never pitied her, he simply remained there beside her. When her final confession faded into silence, and the room settled into a gentle stillness, Arya turned toward the man sitting beside her. In that quiet moment, she realized something that surprised even herself. For the first time since the day she'd lost everything, she no longer wanted to run away. She no longer wanted to hide behind walls or push people out of her life. Instead, she wanted to stay exactly where she was, beside the man who'd quietly walked into her life and remained there longer than anyone else ever had. Not long afterward, Sinclair Fine Art hosted an elegant art gala that brought together some of the most influential names in the worlds of collecting and investment. Arya moved gracefully through the crowd, with the confidence of a woman who'd truly reclaimed her place. Her deep sapphire gown emphasized both her elegance and quiet strength, while her warm brown eyes reflected the pride she'd paid such an unbearable price to earn. In the middle of the evening, a distinguished foreign gentleman approached her. It was Julian Ashford, a renowned British art investor whose effortless charm and captivating smile had become almost legendary. "Miss Sinclair, it's finally my privilege to meet you," he said, bowing slightly, as he lifted her hand and brushed it with a courteous kiss, a gesture that was as calculated as it was refined. "I must say, your reputation doesn't do you justice." Arya offered him a polite smile. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Ashford." Julian's smile never faded, and his eyes never left hers. "A woman as brilliant and beautiful as you must make everyone in this room envious. May I have the honor of this dance?" She hesitated for only a moment before placing her hand in his. After all, it was only a formal dance, nothing more. Julian guided her onto the dance floor, maintaining a perfectly respectable distance, yet there was something lingering in his gaze that quietly awakened her caution. Before the music had even reached its final movement, Arya became aware of an intense stare fixed upon her. She turned her head and immediately found Dante standing on the opposite side of the ballroom. His expression remained perfectly composed, but his steel-gray eyes had darkened beneath an emotion she recognized instantly. Jealousy. He crossed the room with long, determined strides, ignoring every greeting directed toward him. When he reached them, he stopped, his deep voice sharp enough to slice through the atmosphere around them. "Arya, I need to speak with you for a moment." Julian raised an eyebrow, his smile remaining perfectly calm. "Mr. Moretti, it seems your friend doesn't enjoy sharing the spotlight," he teased lightly. Dante answered him with an icy stare. "You've had your dance. Now, if you'll excuse us." Arya let out a quiet sigh before taking Dante gently by the arm and leading him away toward a secluded corner. By the time they reached the nearly deserted parking area beneath the glow of the evening lights, she finally turned to face him. "What exactly was that?" she demanded, her voice low with frustration. Dante spun toward her, unable to contain the anger rising inside him any longer. "Didn't you see it? That man wasn't interested in art or business. He was flirting with you." Arya folded her arms across her chest. A spark of stubbornness flashed through her warm brown eyes. "And if he was, then that's my business, not yours. I don't belong to you, Dante." Her words stopped him cold. For a long moment he simply looked at her, his eyes filled with a painful mixture of longing and wounded honesty. "You're right," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I can't stand watching you with another man." The air between them suddenly became unbearably heavy, stretched as tightly as a wire ready to snap. Before Arya could say another word, Dante reached for her, pulling her gently into his arms, before pressing his lips against hers. The kiss was fierce, overflowing with every ounce of anger, longing, and emotion he'd kept buried for so long. Arya froze. Her heart pounded wildly inside her chest. For one fleeting instant, she almost kissed him back. She almost allowed herself to melt completely into his embrace. But reason returned just in time. She pushed him away, breathing hard. "You can't do that," she whispered, her voice trembling. Then she turned and hurried toward her car, leaving Dante standing alone beneath the glow of the nightlights. Yet as she drove away into the darkness, both of them knew there was one truth neither of them could deny any longer. During that brief, unforgettable moment, they'd both felt something undeniably real, something profound, something that had forever changed them. From that night on, neither of them could ever pretend it had never existed. The next day began like any other. Arya arrived at the office early and buried herself in reports and meetings. Yet something felt different. Something subtle kept creeping into her thoughts, making it impossible for her to concentrate. Dante didn't show up. He didn't call. He didn't text. He didn't find an excuse to stop by her office the way he always did. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, his absence kept stirring an uneasy feeling deep inside her. After the kiss they had shared the night before, he should have been the one to come looking for her. Instead, there was nothing but complete silence. The more she thought about it, the more unsettled she became. The entire day passed with her unable to sit still. Finally, late that evening, when she couldn't bear it any longer, she hurriedly threw on her coat and drove straight to his penthouse. She rang the doorbell several times, but no one answered. Her heart pounded harder with every passing second. At last, she pulled out the spare key he had given her in case of an emergency, and, with trembling hands, slipped it into the lock. Inside, the apartment was dim and silent. The only sound was the faint murmur of the television, echoing through the room. Then she saw him. Dante was lying motionless on the sofa beneath a thin blanket. His face had turned pale, and every breath came slow and heavy. "Dante!" Panic swept over her as she rushed to his side and placed her hand against his forehead. She jerked back in shock the instant she felt the intense heat radiating from his skin. He was burning with a high fever. He slowly opened his eyes, surprised to find her standing there. "Arya, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice hoarse and strained. She frowned with worry. "Your fever is so high. I have to take you to the hospital right now." But just as she reached for her phone, his weak hand gently wrapped around her wrist. "Don't, it's just the flu. I just need some rest." Arya stared at him in disbelief. "You're burning up, and you're telling me you don't need a hospital?" He forced a tired smile. "If I go to the hospital, they'll draw blood, and I hate needles." A soft laugh escaped her. She couldn't believe it. The most powerful man in Chicago, the man who could make an entire city tremble, was afraid of one tiny needle. "You're absolutely hopeless," she said, shaking her head. Then she stood and walked into the kitchen. She brewed a pot of hot tea, found a clean towel, soaked it in cool water, and returned to the living room. Kneeling beside the sofa, she gently placed the cool cloth across his forehead. "This'll help bring your fever down," she whispered. Dante opened his eyes, just enough to look at her. There was an unfamiliar tenderness in his gaze. "You don't have to do all this for me," he whispered. She answered simply, "Yes, I do." And so she stayed with him through the entire night. She kept replacing the cool towel, helped him sip warm tea a little at a time, and remained by his side, watching over every breath he took. Eventually, exhaustion overtook her. She fell asleep beside the edge of the sofa, her head resting gently against his chest. When the first rays of morning sunlight streamed through the windows, Arya slowly woke to the warmth of a gentle touch. Dante's hand was softly stroking her hair. As she lifted her head, she found him looking at her. His eyes were much clearer than they had been the night before. "Did you stay here all night?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "You were that sick. Someone had to stay with you." Dante looked at her for a long moment. Then, in a voice warmer than she'd ever heard before, he finally spoke the words he'd kept hidden for so long. "I love you, Arya." Her heart skipped a beat, but this time she didn't panic. She didn't run away. She didn't build another wall around herself. She didn't deny her own feelings the way she always had before. She simply looked straight into his eyes, and with complete sincerity, she answered with the words she'd held back for far too long. "I love you too, Dante." A smile spread across his face. A smile filled with happiness and relief. Something rarely seen on the face of the man who had always seemed so cold. Then, he drew her into a warm embrace, and in that single moment, every wall, every fear, and every barrier they had spent so long building around themselves finally melted away completely. Sometime after Dante had fully recovered, on a quiet weekend afternoon, he told Arya that he wanted to take her somewhere special. No matter how many times she asked, he only answered with a mysterious smile and refused to reveal anything. Soon, the car carried them away from the bustling streets of Chicago, following the lakeside road until it came to a stop in front of a cozy wooden house nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan, where the vast water reflected the brilliant colors of the setting sun, and the cool breeze carried the fresh scent of water and wild grass. Arya stepped out of the car, unable to hide her amazement. "Dante, this place is beautiful," she breathed, and without saying a word, he simply took her hand and led her along the shoreline beneath the gentle glow of the fading evening light. They walked side by side for a long while in comfortable silence. Then Dante came to a stop and turned to face her, his eyes holding a depth she had never seen before. "There's something I want to tell you," he began, his voice low and sincere. "Before I met you, I was a completely different man. I was cold, I was arrogant, I cared about nothing except power and my own ambitions. I lived in a world where everyone lowered their heads and agreed with everything I wanted, and I honestly believed that was what strength looked like." Arya listened without saying a word, her warm brown eyes fixed on his face. "Then you came into my life," he continued, the faintest smile touching his lips. "You were a woman who wasn't afraid to challenge me, who wasn't afraid to speak your mind right to my face. You never trembled because of the Moretti name. At first, it irritated me more than I can describe, but then I realized you were the first person who showed me just how incomplete my life had been. You made me want to become a better man, a kinder man, a man capable of loving someone else." His voice caught ever so slightly. "You taught me that power and money don't mean a thing if there's no one beside me to share this life with." Arya felt her heart tighten, and tears slowly gathered in her eyes. Then, to her complete astonishment, Dante slowly lowered himself onto one knee on the soft grass beside the lake. Reaching into his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a dazzling diamond ring that sparkled beneath the golden light of the sunset. "Arya Sinclair," he said, his steel-gray eyes now filled with nothing but tenderness and absolute sincerity. "You walked into my life when I thought I didn't need anyone. You showed me what it truly means to be loved. I want to do this the right way. I want to love you the way you deserve to be loved, with respect, with patience, and with every piece of my heart. Will you marry me?" Tears streamed down Arya's cheeks, but they were tears of pure happiness, the kind of happiness she hadn't dared believe she could ever experience again. She didn't need even a single second to think. "Yes," she whispered through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you." Dante's face lit up with the brightest smile she had ever seen. He rose to his feet, gently slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and held her tightly, as though he were afraid this precious moment might disappear if he let go. Arya buried her face against his warm chest, listening to the joyful rhythm of his heartbeat. And in that unforgettable moment, beside the endless waters of Lake Michigan beneath the glowing sunset, she finally understood that there were no barriers left between them. There was no painful past left to run from. There were no walls left to build. There were no fears left to hide behind. There was only love, and a future stretching wide before them, waiting to be lived together. Several months later, in a lush green garden stretching along the shores of Lake Michigan, Dante and Arya's wedding unfolded in a setting that looked as though it had been lifted from a dream. Pure white flowers lined the aisle, elegant rows of chairs faced the shimmering water, and the gentle sound of waves blended with the cool breeze, creating an atmosphere that felt both sacred and warmly intimate. Dante stood waiting at the altar in a perfectly tailored dark suit. The moment Arya appeared at the end of the aisle in her radiant white wedding gown, her dark brown hair falling in soft curls around her shoulders and her face glowing with happiness, his heart seemed to stop for a single breathtaking moment. She was so purely beautiful, so effortlessly radiant, that he simply couldn't take his eyes off her. When she finally reached him, Dante gently took both of her hands into his own and leaned close enough to whisper that she looked absolutely beautiful. Tears of overwhelming joy shimmered in Arya's warm brown eyes. When it was time to exchange their vows, Dante drew a slow, steady breath before speaking. His voice was deep, warm, and filled with emotion. "From the very first moment I saw you, you challenged me. You never bowed your head to me. You never blindly accepted everything I said. That's exactly what made me fall in love with you. You taught me how to become a better man. You showed me that power and wealth mean nothing if there's no one beside me to share this life with. I promise to love you, to respect you, and to do everything I can to make you happy every single day for the rest of my life." Then it was Arya's turn. Looking at him through her tears, her voice trembling yet unwavering, she confessed that she had spent her entire life fighting alone. She had always believed she'd never be able to trust another person again. But he had been patient with her. He had never given up on her. And now she knew with absolute certainty that she never wanted to live another day without him. They exchanged rings, and when the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, Dante drew her into his arms and kissed her tenderly, as joyful applause erupted from every friend and loved one gathered around them, marking the beginning of a beautiful new chapter in their lives. Their honeymoon passed like a perfect dream, and when they returned home, married life became even more wonderful than either of them had ever imagined. Then one morning, Arya began to notice that something felt different. She felt unusually tired. A wave of nausea came and went. When she held the test results in her hands, her heart burst with indescribable happiness. She was pregnant. When she visited her doctor to confirm the news, her joy multiplied beyond anything she had imagined, because she wasn't carrying just one precious life. She was carrying two. She was expecting twins. That evening, with trembling hands, she placed the ultrasound images into Dante's hands and quietly shared the news. For a brief moment he stood frozen. Then laughter burst from him, pure and overflowing with happiness, as he swept her into his arms and spun her around. "We're going to have a little boy and a little girl," she whispered. Dante gently cupped her face with one hand, kissed her forehead with profound tenderness, and softly told her that she had just given him the greatest happiness he had ever known. The months that followed were filled with nothing but love. Dante became more thoughtful and gentle than ever before. Every evening he would sit beside Arya, speaking softly to the two little babies growing inside her. He cared for her in every possible way, never overlooking even the smallest detail. Then, on one peaceful evening, as they sat together watching the sun slowly disappear beyond the waters of Lake Michigan, Dante wrapped his arms around her, rested his hand upon her growing belly, and quietly said, "We fought together to reclaim an empire. Now we're going to build something even more precious. We're going to build a family filled with the love we've both deserved all along." Arya rested her head against his shoulder, her heart overflowing with a peace she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. And in that quiet, beautiful moment, she realized that she finally had everything she had ever dreamed of. A home, a love that was real, a family growing stronger every single day. She also knew, with complete certainty, that from this moment forward, she'd never have to face the world alone again. If this story touched your heart, don't hesitate to press the like button and share this video with the people you love, so they can experience this journey alongside you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications, so you'll never miss another heartfelt and meaningful story. How did Dante and Arya's story make you feel? Which moment moved you the most? We'd love to hear your thoughts, so please leave a comment and share what touched your heart, because your stories and feelings truly matter to us. We wish everyone watching today good health, lasting peace, endless happiness, and a life filled with joy. Thank you for spending this time with us, and we'll see you again in our next story.